Hi guys, welcome back to another video. So today is another Monday, therefore we are going to be working on another little spread in my sketchbook. So let's go ahead and flip to a new page. So I have not done a little watercolor spread in my sketchbook for quite a while, and I think some of you guys know this, but because the sketchbook is technically a notebook, it has fairly thin paper. So a lot of like water-based mediums, I tend to not gravitate towards too much on paper like this, just because it's not meant to take in a lot of like the water or to get like a lot of moisture. But from like previous sketchbooks, there are some sketches that I really liked that I've done with watercolor, but I do kind of end up using it in kind of like a particular way. So I'm gonna show you again because it's been a while. So first of all, we are going to be sketching out with just a normal mechanical pencil. I am not using the Pilot Color Eno or the Colorase, or I think it's the Uni Diacolor colored lead. So I usually kind of use those whenever I'm painting to let the lead kind of dissolve alongside with my sketch, usually to kind of better hide it within the painting. But this time, because we're doing just a sketch in my sketchbook, I am just going to sketch normally with graphite, and this is more typically because when I used to apply watercolor onto my sketches, it was on sketches that were already done with kind of like graphite in general, just like a way that was nice to add color. And the thing I like the most about watercolor, especially for doing things like sketches or wanting to apply color into your sketchbook, is the fact that as long as your palette has like a good range of colors, you kind of have every color at your disposal. I know with like alcohol markers, colored pencils, water-based markers, fine liners, all that jazz, you're kind of limited towards the colors that you own. I know some of the colors obviously you can layer up and blend. Let's say with water-based markers, you could layer up a little bit and be at the mercy of like pilling from the paper, or you can do some layering with the alcohol markers as well. But being able to mix a lot of like your own colors that you want to use from just like a few pans of watercolor is always nice. So I'll show you guys that in a little bit. So let me talk about who we are drawing today, because it might be a little bit recognizable and maybe not, just because I drew her a little bit off, I feel like. So this is a character from Honkai Star Rail. If you guys are not familiar with that, hopefully I'll remember to put her picture on the screen, but I believe her name is Fugue. I am not too sure if it's supposed to have like more like a name rather than the word, so I'm gonna refer to her as Fugue, but hopefully it's not Fugue. I know I've heard some people say it as that way, or like some other kind of like altered way of saying it, but I think her name is Fugue. I really like her design, and obviously if you're not familiar with the storyline, I guess too much, but you might have seen like a character at the very beginning at Honkai Star Rail named Tingyun. So yeah, she looks very similar to her, which I won't spoil why if you're not caught up with like story or like lore wise, but she is a character that I really wanted to draw because one, her design's really pretty, and second, obviously, I've mentioned in the past that I don't draw a lot of characters that tend to gravitate towards, I guess, like the warmer color palette, so like a lot of like browns and reds and oranges. So I've been trying my best to allow myself to draw more characters in that direction. I prefer colors that are more towards like greens and blues and like the cooler tones, just because it's my own preference. So I do want to at least give more of a go to characters that have like that warmer color scheme, I guess. Even though, speaking of like ensemble stars, a lot of the characters that I tend to like actually have like the reddish brown or like red orange or just red hair, so maybe I'll go back to drawing some on-star characters again. But let's talk a little bit more about the process. So after I did do the sketch, so because I know already that I'm going to be adding watercolor as my next step, I'm not treating the sketch exactly how I would usually approach it. So if I'm sketching more naturally, I will tend to shade and darken things as I kind of go after I finish like doing the very rough stages. But for this case, I do know I'm using watercolor, so after I did the rough sketch, I'm doing almost like a super clean pass, almost akin to line art in a sense, because I don't want to lose my lines if we do end up going towards more darker colors. So to make sure that I don't lose them, we need to have a little bit more structure and also make those lines a little bit darker. Moving right along, we are going to be using the Mei Liang kind of watercolor set. So this one I have been using the most because of its portability and the size of it, alongside with the plethora of colors. So it's been my favorite for a while. I haven't touched my own like personal palette of colors that has like a lot of Holbein watercolors. I think once I go back to doing some larger pieces, I will definitely revert back to using that one because I can use a lot more larger brushes, and I probably need a bigger mixing pan or mixing areas, which my older palette used to have. So, but I guess like for now, I like using the smaller one because it's just more convenient. It doesn't take up a lot of space. I feel very comfortable with it, and I always love the brush that it comes with because it's super sharp, holds a lot of water, and it's easy for me to have a lot of control with it without having to switch to many different brushes. So if you're familiar watching me paint with gouache, I tend to do watercolor as kind of like the first pass. So I'm kind of treating it a little bit similar in this sense, but because watercolor is going to be only the color that's going to be applied, I am going to be a little bit more careful compared to how I usually do it when I kind of like paint with gouache. So for gouache, I will have to do like another pass with a paint that's more opaque, and I can clean up things, fix up things and all that. But for this one, I do have to be a little bit more particular because the pass of watercolor is not going to be covered up by anything. So I do have to layer up from light to dark. But if you have like a preferred way of working with watercolors, you can probably just do that. I've done plenty of other ones where I didn't really plan out the colors or really make everything like kind of clean. So I just kind of used like a brush that wasn't very sharp and just like blocked in colors kind of willy-nilly, and then we'll deal with the rest kind of later when we do actual kind of like cleanup or line art of some sort. So a good portion of this will be mostly focusing on the watercolor portion, but my favorite part of doing kind of like these watercolor sketch-ish like stuff in my sketchbook is actually being able to put a little bit more contrast later with kind of like a darker line. So you can do this with like a multi-liner, a fine liner. You can even go back with your pencil and just like really darken things up. You can use colored pencils or even just like a ballpoint pen, which is usually my preferred method. So the fun thing about using watercolors, if your pans have some colors that are a little bit more opaque, so they might have a little bit more like white present in the pigment. So oftentimes a lot of like the pastel colors have that typical pigment present. So they apply a little bit more opaque if you don't dilute it as much. So I take this to my advantage every so often whenever I'm adding in some cooler areas. Sometimes I like to put in kind of like a lavender or like a soft light purple, or even kind of like a teal color, which you'll see me put into Fugue's hair alongside with some portions of her clothing. So the majority of her color palette has a lot of like red and brown. It also has like a lot of gold as well. So I tried my best to allow myself to add in some cooler colors into certain areas that might help with like a little bit of reflective light coming in. So to kind of like offset how dark sometimes the shadows can be, I do add a little bit of like reflective or bounce light of a different color. So in this case, I've mentioned a lot before that if I'm doing something that's a little bit more like on the warmer side, like a orange or a red, teal or like a turquoise or like light bluish color I love using. So it just looks nice, kind of like complementary-ish. So I like adding it into some of the areas just to add a touch of a different color or pigment to make things look a little bit more vibrant, or just like add a little bit more visual interest. So oftentimes when I'm doing these types of watercolor sketches in my sketchbook and I'm painting in certain areas, I do like keeping majority of my washes kind of on the lighter side, just because I do like having a line art that makes the kind of majority of the contrast kind of let the sketch pop out from the page. But if you're more confident with like painting, or you want to embellish a little bit more with some other colored medium, I think it's sometimes nice to just like really push the colors as much as you can. So there are some areas like in Fugue's kind of like clothing that I do end up making it more like a blackish brown rather than just like a pure kind of like chocolatey brownish color. So I did want to have a little bit of contrast here and there just because it looked nicer with the teal, because it was a little bit too light. But otherwise kept everything kind of light-ish, and then we will darken some lines up just to make sure that things kind of pop. Another thing is that the way how I sketched this one in particular, I was not sure if I was gonna do like a sketch page-esque kind of format where I would do like kind of like a larger sketch and then I would do some smaller ones around it. I was having a lot of fun just mixing colors and playing around with it, so instead I decided to put a little bit of a blue to yellow gradient wash into the background. And later on, I don't think I like this decision. She doesn't really look like she's laying down, and that wasn't my like initial intention anyways, but as I started to add more washes and I wanted to add more to the background, I ended up putting some sort of like drop shadow, which kind of indicates that she's closer to the back surface than she actually is. So even though it doesn't look like she's laying down, I feel like the drop shadow kind of makes it appear that way, that she's closer to the surface than she actually is. So apologies for that. I don't think it was necessary for me to do that, and I think the lighter kind of wash into the background would have sufficed and kind of actually worked a little bit better than me like continuously putting more shadows and darker colors into the background. I should have just kept everything light because it just didn't seem as necessary. And this is kind of like the area where I was making things kind of get into that dark brown to blackish area. I don't know why I was going so dark to that certain area. I wanted it closer to the sleeves so that you can see that I'm adding in a little bit more of that teal color to kind of make sure that there's enough contrast between the darkness of her sleeve and then some reflective or bounce light or something of that sort. I do think like in the future I will probably start to paint a little bit more in my sketchbook. I did mention in previous times that I want to get more comfortable painting with gouache, but at this point, unless I feel like super motivated to use gouache, I probably won't use it as much as I probably would like to. But if anything, I would like to add more watercoloring into my sketchbook in general, just because, like I said, it has a little bit more versatility in terms of adding the colors that I want for my character. Even though whenever I work with markers, I do like doing the limited color palette. It does kind of like activate a different part of my brain that I need to do a little bit more focus when it comes to like planning out certain areas, or if I have to plan out I guess like contrast or form and stuff a little bit more consciously. I feel like the most recent ones that I've done have not been good examples of it. I've been very lazy with the application of it, which kind of like in turn makes the page look a little bit more messy. So I want to be a little bit more conscious when I'm doing those spreads in my sketchbook. But painting like this is fun. I can paint a little bit more accurate to the character's colors and just play around with the washes, because watercolor is still one of my favorite mediums ever. So I would like to continue using it, and obviously I love using graphite, so being able to use them together would be great. And hopefully just, I don't know, I just like adding a little bit more color into my sketchbook every so often. It's just fun to see those bright pops of like different spreads in the sketchbook if you constantly do more like grayscale, or if you do like a monochromatic look in your sketchbook. It's just nice to have a little bit of a different spread from time to time if you're ever like looking back at your own sketchbooks. So now with most of our washes and kind of like color laid down, it's kind of mostly finished, I'm gonna go ahead and pick out a ballpoint pen. So this is the Papermate Inkojoy Ballpoint Pen, and I've used these in several videos before, and it's one of my favorites. I'm not too sure if like the recent ones that I've bought are a little bit, I don't know, they don't exactly have the same consistency, and I think it'll depend on your own preference. At the time, I think I liked the fact that they dispensed a lot of ink, but it wasn't really like blotchy, if it makes sense. Like cheaper ballpoint pens sometimes kind of leave like a little blot of ink at the start or the ending of your line sometimes, or it builds up ink at the very end of your roller because it is a ball at the end, so it kind of gets a little bit inconsistent or thick at times. But I've always liked the Papermate Inkojoy pens. One has a plentiful amount of colors for you to work with, but also just the consistency of the ink was always nice. But for some reason, this black pen requires me to always go back and forth a lot more to dispense ink, rather than being able to just do like one kind of like flowy line and have the ink come out properly. Also, I don't know how to explain this because it doesn't really affect you too much. I needed to, well, it kind of affects you a little bit. So if I lay my sketchbook completely flat on my desk, because we are in winter time, I have to use a lot more artificial light, and the glare on my sketchbook is kind of horrendous when it comes to using graphite or like ballpoint pen or anything that's kind of like remotely reflective. So it catches the light and it creates glare whenever my camera is like facing my sketchbook. So I actually have it tilted kind of at a, I don't know, it's like maybe 20-degree angle ish. I'm just laying it on top of the watercolor box tin that I have in front of me so that I can kind of create it at an angle so you can kind of see the contrast between the watercolors and the pen, because you can see that the pencil becomes very light even though the lines are still apparent and I can still see them. I want to accentuate certain lines so that it appears a little bit more cleaner than you think. So this is very similar to when I'm working on pencil drawings or graphite drawings, where I start to sketch kind of like messy but still on the lighter side. But once we start to actually build up our values, we start to shade, we add a little bit more contrast in our lines and all that, I start to really push the contrast to the point where a lot of my softer rough lines you don't really see as clearly, but they're still present. I don't really feel the need to really erase them out of the way or anything like that. So it kind of has two stages of sketch lines for this one, because you had my really rough lines where I was doing a lot of the planning and trying to figure out how I wanted things to look, and then we did a second pass where I did like a cleaner sketch, I guess, before we did the watercolor, and then now I'm doing the pen layer. I've always liked the look of being able to see everyone's like sketch process, so being able to see their lines that are not like part of their, I guess like their final lines is always neat to see. So I've always loved leaving in my own whenever I do like sketching and stuff. So when I use the ballpoint pen, I try my best to make sure that the lines that I make with the ballpoint pen are a little bit more clear, and I'm picking specific sketch lines that I think are the most accurate to what I want it to be. So there are some lines that like are more for I guess like in this case, there's not really any for shading or form per se, but a lot of them was like planning out direction, let's say for hair strands or like shaping out where the body was and all that jazz. But what I'm doing with the pen is that I'm picking out the lines that I want to really accentuate. So it kind of just creates everything to make it look like it has a cleaner look. Also, I didn't really notice this too much when I was working with pen, or I never really knew the reason why. Oh, there's like one thing I wanted to point out. I think at some point, I think it's around here, you'll see that my pen unscrews itself every so often, and I did not know for the longest time why it did that. And as I was watching myself work with the pen more recently, I now know why. So I'm gonna put up a clip of when I work with like graphite or pencil. I do have a habit of re-gripping my pencil or my pen every so often, just because that's how I like to sketch. And the kind of habit stems from the fact that I like getting the sharpest line I can get with my mechanical pencil. So if you use one side of the mechanical pencil, it'll start to get wider and flatter and kind of like not sharp. But as soon as you turn it back to where the point is, you can kind of get a sharp dark line. So because of that, I end up doing that with the ballpoint pen, which is not really as necessary because you can't really sharpen your line per se. But apparently I do it anyways, probably because of out of habit. So I tend to re-grip, and I guess the way how I do it is that I rotate the pen. So I guess when I'm rotating it in my hand, I'm rotating the bottom portion of the barrel mostly, while the other portion remains in my hand, which causes it to turn. And I guess I unscrew it over time. So I think I know why I do it now, but I can't really prevent myself unless I'm like super conscious about it. But I think that's it for the line art or like inking process. You can see I didn't do every single portion here, and you can kind of see what the glare looks like. I can't really prevent the glare for myself, but at least I could prevent it for you guys when you're viewing it. But this is kind of what the finished little watercolor sketch looks like. I definitely want to do more of these in the future. I just love playing around with watercolor washes and stuff, and you can kind of see there's no bleed through, minus like where I messed up and let some water peep through from the bottom of the page. But there is minimal warping because it is such thin paper, but it's not too bothersome that I can't work on the other side. Or if I do have problems, I can always just like paste in sticker paper or something else on top. But hopefully you guys enjoyed today's little session. I will probably see you guys after the little holidays, or Christmas I guess in this case. But hope you guys enjoyed watching today's video, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye!